I have been a casual chess enjoyer since childhood, and I discovered Magnus in 2022. What caught me first wasn't really the chess itself, since I already know chess well enough to follow what's happening. It was how little he seemed to care about the things everyone else at that level takes so seriously. He'd show up in jeans and a hoodie against guys in blazers, half asleep in his chair, and still win comfortably. My first read on that was pretty cynical, that this was branding the rebel genius who doesn't play by anyone's script. I've seen that costume before, worn by people who care exactly as much as everyone else, but want credit for seeming above it. So I went in skeptical, not really about his chess, which speaks for itself, but about what was actually going on in his head. I wanted to understand what competing even means for someone who's already beaten the entire field. That's the question I ended up chasing through years of his interviews. The thing that first cracked that skepticism was July 2022, when at the absolute peak of his powers, 5-time world champion, he announced he wouldn't defend the title again. It wasn't injury or age. He said plainly on his own podcast that he simply wasn't motivated to play another match and didn't feel he had much left to gain from it. That's a strange thing for someone at the top of a competitive field to admit out loud. Most players in that position keep performing hunger even once it's faded, because saying otherwise sounds like weakness. He just said it anyway and moved on with his life. A branding stunt keeps the trophy and chases the attention, and this was the reverse of that, giving away the biggest prize in the sport for nothing. That only really makes sense if the trophy itself had genuinely stopped meaning what it used to mean to him. I went looking for why and found the clearest answer in a long conversation he had with Lex Fridman a few weeks after the announcement. Fridman asked him something simple, whether it's the love of winning or the fear of losing that actually drives him, and Magnus split the answer cleanly down the middle. The World Championship, he said, had always run mostly on fear, specifically the fear of losing an identity he'd spent over a decade building around that title. Everything else, the regular tournaments, ran on something closer to love of winning, and he said he actually got more joy out of winning a normal event than out of winning the championship itself, because winning the championship had mostly just felt like relief. Relief isn't the same thing as joy. It's closer to the absence of a disaster you'd been dreading. I sat with that distinction for a while because I'd always assumed reaching the very top of a competitive field feels like winning, when for him it apparently felt mostly like not losing, which looks identical from the outside and really isn't. There's a smaller detail from that same interview that stuck with me too, where he admits he gets genuinely nervous before games, not the performative kind athletes sometimes claim. Once the game actually starts, he says the nerves mostly disappear because his attention gets pulled fully into the position in front of him. The fear doesn't get defeated so much as it gets crowded out by having an actual problem to solve. He's also said something I found genuinely strange, that he thinks his opponents would probably play better against him if they didn't know it was him sitting across the board. Reputation itself has become a kind of psychological weapon separate from the chess, and he's self-aware enough about it to name that out loud rather than pretend it isn't happening. Once I had the fear versus love distinction in my head, the rest of what he says about training started making a different kind of sense. Once I had the fear versus love distinction in my head, the rest of what he says about training started making a different kind of sense. There's another thread worth pulling here about how he actually makes decisions. Once he's sitting at the board, he's talked about preferring positions that stay complicated over positions that simplify into a safe draw, even when the safe draw would technically protect his rating. That's a real choice, not just a style preference, because every complicated position carries risk of losing that a quiet draw doesn't. He seems to pick the risk on purpose fairly often, which only makes sense if boredom actually costs him more than a rating point does. There's a bit from that same conversation where he talks about wanting to reach a rating of 2,900, a number no human has ever hit. He's upfront that it's unlikely and that getting there wouldn't really be about some leap in raw talent so much as eliminating every bad day he's allowed to have and tightening preparation until almost nothing is left to chance. Then he says the actual reason he set that goal almost as an aside, which is that he needed something to play for, because otherwise these days he's mostly just playing for fun. There's something almost funny about a guy who has already won everything worth winning, manufacturing an impossible target purely so a random Tuesday still has real stakes attached to it. That's when this whole thing stopped feeling like a story about a guy who beat everyone. It turned into a story about what a competitive mind actually does once the opponent stopped being the real obstacle, because there's basically nobody left who can consistently threaten him, and the fight has to go somewhere or it just quietly dissolves. In his case, it seems to have relocated inward, against boredom, against his own drift, against a hungrier version of himself from 5 years back. That's a strange kind of opponent to pick. Since you can never actually beat it for good, you just have to show up and beat it again the next day. It's worth hearing how he describes actual practice too, because it cuts against the discipline grinder image. People tend to project onto anyone at his level. He said flatly that structured drills never worked for him, that his first coach assigned him exercises to do at home early on and eventually gave up, because Magnus either skipped them or didn't take them seriously enough for them to matter. What he's actually good at, by his own account, is fast evaluation and short calculation, reading a position quickly and trusting an instinct that's been shaped by thousands of games rather than by deliberate repetition. That's a different picture from the standard 10,000 hour story we tell about mastery, closer to talent that got pointed at a target early and mostly left to run on its own. That's worth sitting with if you're an actual player trying to improve rather than just watching from the outside, because it cuts against most of the advice you'd normally hear. The usual line is to grind more positions and drill more endgames and simply put in the hours. His version of mastery sounds a lot less about volume and a lot more about how cleanly and quickly he can read a position once the material is already in his head. I don't think that makes drilling pointless for the rest of us, since most players need the repetition precisely because they haven't built his level of pattern recognition yet, but it does suggest the real ceiling isn't about who can grind the longest so much as about how sharp your read on a position becomes, and that's a much harder thing to train directly than simply logging more hours. If discipline was never really the engine for him, boredom becomes the real threat instead, which probably explains why he keeps having to invent stakes that don't exist naturally anymore. If discipline was never really the engine for him, boredom becomes the real threat instead, which probably explains why he keeps having to invent stakes that don't exist naturally anymore. Different formats seem to test completely different parts of that mindset too. Classical chess rewards patience stretched across hours, sometimes an entire day for one game, and he said the mental fatigue from that stretch is its own separate skill from actually calculating well. Blitz and rapid strip that stretch away almost entirely and reward something closer to raw pattern recognition under a ticking clock, which is probably why freestyle, with its blend of no memorized openings and faster time controls, ended up appealing to him the way it did. I want to be careful not to turn this into one clean unified theory though, because a few things I found later complicate it quite a bit. The freestyle chess turn is where the self-manufactured stakes idea gets real backup. Around 2023, Magnus started saying openly that classical chess bored him, specifically the part where a game's outcome gets half decided before anyone even sits down, by whoever memorized deeper opening theory with an engine at home the night before. He's called that closer to a memorization contest than a creativity contest. So he threw his weight and eventually his own money behind Fisher Random, sometimes called Chess 960, where the back row pieces get shuffled into a new arrangement before the game starts. No opening preparation survives that shuffle, and everyone is genuinely on their own from the first move. That's essentially the same complaint Bobby Fischer made about the sport decades earlier when he invented the format in the first place. Here's the part that actually amused me. Magnus didn't just endorse the format for other people from a distance, he started playing it constantly and dominating it just as thoroughly as he dominated classical chess, winning his first 7 games in a row at one event in Karlsruhe with a performance rating over 3,000. He picked the one format specifically built to erase the advantage of accumulated preparation designed to flatten the field, and he flattened the field anyway. That tells you the real appeal probably isn't fairness at all. It's novelty, since for the first time in years he genuinely doesn't already know the correct first move. There's a psychological cost to that kind of exposure too, worth naming honestly. Playing without any prepared safety net means every single game carries a real chance of walking into an unfamiliar position and simply not finding the right idea in time. He seems to have decided that risk is worth it for the sake of staying interested, which tells you something about how he ranks discomfort against boredom, choosing the discomfort every time given the option. This is actually where I started rethinking what being a grandmaster measures in the first place, because classical ratings partly reward whoever has absorbed the most published theory. That's a real skill, but not really the one people picture when they imagine chess genius. Freestyle strips that layer away entirely and leaves something closer to pure calculation and pattern reading under pressure with nowhere to hide behind memorized lines. That Magnus still wins almost everything once that layer is stripped away tells you the memorization was probably never where his actual edge lived. It was always underneath it, in how fast and how accurately he reads a position nobody has ever seen before, which is a much harder thing to fake and a much harder thing to build than opening preparation ever was. Then there's the part that made me genuinely uncomfortable because it doesn't fit. Either the noble seeker of fresh challenge story or the amused genius can't help winning story. It starts in September 2022 when Magnus lost a classical game to a 19-year-old named Hans Niemann, snapping a 53-game unbeaten run that had stood for a very long time. He withdrew from the tournament the very next day without explaining why. 2 weeks later, in an online rematch, he played a single move and resigned on the spot with his camera off. It wasn't until weeks after that he finally said what he'd been thinking, that he believed Neiman had cheated more than he'd publicly admitted. He said something about his opponent's focus in the critical moments of their game hadn't read as fully genuine to him. FIDE eventually investigated the whole episode and found no evidence of cheating in that specific game and ruled that Magnus's withdrawal had been without valid reason. That makes for an odd contrast against a man who had just spent an entire interview explaining that titles and match cycles mattered less to him than they used to. The fallout from that episode went beyond just the two of them, worth mentioning briefly. Tournaments afterward started adding metal detectors and broadcast delays, a direct response to how seriously the chess world ended up taking the accusation even without hard proof attached to it. That tells you Magnus's instinct wasn't dismissed as pure paranoia by everyone around him, even while FIDE formally ruled against how he chose to handle it. There's a chess-specific detail buried in his own explanation that I almost skipped past the first time through. What actually triggered his suspicion wasn't some external piece of evidence, it was a read on his opponent's focus, whether Neiman seemed fully locked in during the critical moments of the game. That's the exact same evaluative instinct he uses on positions, just aimed at a person instead of a board. It tells you something about how total that kind of attention becomes at his level. He isn't just reading pieces and squares anymore. He's reading tension and demeanor, and whether the person across the table is actually present the way the position demands. Once that skill exists in someone, it seems to keep running constantly, whether he wants it to or not. If chess had genuinely become mostly fun for him by that point, that reaction doesn't track cleanly at all. It reads more like someone discovering that the one arena where he still held total uncontested command, simply being better than anyone else at the actual game, had just been threatened. That produced something rawer than anything he's ever said about losing a championship match. I don't have a tidy explanation for that gap, and I'm not going to force one into existence. Letting go of caring about winning and letting go of caring about being cheated don't seem to be the same kind of letting go at all, even though they sound closely related on paper. The Gene story, by comparison, feels almost restful to get into after that. It happened in December 2024 at the World Rapid and Blitz Championships, where Magnus showed up wearing jeans, which the dress code explicitly bans. He was fined $200 and told to change before the next round began. He offered to change the following day instead and was told it had to be immediately. At that point, in his own words, it became a matter of principle for him. So he refused, got pulled from the round, and walked out. 2 days later, he returned for the Blitz event wearing another pair of jeans as if nothing had happened. On the surface, that's an easy thing to laugh off, the world's best player quitting an event over a pair of trousers. But listen to how he actually talked about it afterward, and it doesn't sound petulant at all. He said he was too old at that point to care much either way, that nobody wanted to back down, and that's simply where things ended up landing. That reads less like a tantrum than a small, almost experimental test of how much authority an institution still has over him. He'd already handed it the one thing it wanted most, the championship itself 2 years earlier and on his own terms, with the genes standing in for the exact same reflex at a much smaller scale. Notice how differently the sport reacted to this compared to the Neiman affair. With Neiman, plenty of respected voices pushed back hard and called the whole thing a witch hunt, while with the genes, FIDE itself blinked first and loosened its own rule within days. That kind of concession doesn't happen for just anyone. It happens once an institution has already learned it needs the player more than the player needs it. Around that same period, he was skipping the 2024 candidate cycle, and someone asked him how anyone was supposed to know who the best player in the world actually is if he'd opted out of the one event built to answer that exact question. His response was fairly blunt, that the rating system across formats is a decent enough indicator over time. If you really want to know who's best, he said, you don't need one tournament to tell you, you can just look for his name. That's an audacious thing to say out loud, effectively arguing that the sport's own crowning mechanism is optional for him specifically, but it's also a pure version of the same self-assessment instinct running through everything else in these interviews, trusting his own read on the evidence over a ceremony designed to produce an official answer. It only sounds arrogant until you notice it's the identical instinct that makes him good at the game itself, evaluating the position rather than waiting for someone else to hand him a verdict. That same competitive current, still very much alive underneath all of this, shows up hardest in how he talks about losing now. In June 2025, at Norway Chess, he lost a classical game to Gukesh Damaraju and slammed his fist on the table before shaking hands and walking off, which went viral almost immediately. A few days later, on a podcast appearance, he explained what that loss actually felt like from the inside. Part of him thought it was dumb and unnecessary, he said, and it left him feeling, in his own word, washed. Winning feels normal to him these days, almost almost weightless, while losing for a moment makes the world fall apart. He even said that in freestyle chess, he doesn't get stuck wondering why he's doing any of this or what the point is. The clear implication is that in that exact moment against Gukesh in a classical game that meant nothing for any ranking, he very much did wonder that. He also admitted something easy to skip past, that negative feelings simply hit harder for him than positive ones do, that it's just a fact about how his mind processes the game rather than something he's chosen. That asymmetry is worth sitting with because it isn't that wins and losses matter equally and he's reacting proportionally. The scale is permanently tilted toward the losses doing more damage than the wins do good, and he seems fully aware of that tilt without having found a way to correct it. So here's a man who told Lex Fridman that the World Championship mostly ran on fear rather than love, who said he had nothing left to gain from defending it, who spent years publicly arguing that classical chess bores him. And in 2025, he's slamming a table and telling a podcast that a single, ultimately meaningless loss made him feel useless. That shouldn't happen if the fire had actually gone out, the way his 2022 announcement implied, and it clearly hasn't gone out at all. What seems to have changed isn't really how much winning and losing matter to him, it's where he's let them matter. He's rerouted it away from the championship cycle he's decided isn't worth caring about anymore, and left it fully intact everywhere else in freestyle events and rating chases and random classical games against a rising world champion who technically shouldn't be able to touch him emotionally at all. If you ask me, that's the real shape of what competition becomes. Once someone has already reached the top of a field like this, it doesn't shrink so much as it relocates, deliberately in some places and involuntarily in others, usually moving away from whatever arena has stopped delivering anything but relief. It moves instead towards smaller, stranger, self-authored battlegrounds, a rating nobody's ever touched, a shuffled board where nobody, including him, knows the right first move yet, a pair of genes, a single classical game that means nothing on paper and apparently still means enough to produce a fist on a table. I don't think that's a fully healthy way to run a competitive life, and I don't think he'd claim it is either. The line about negative feelings hitting harder than positive ones isn't a guy bragging about resilience, it's someone quietly describing a cost he keeps paying without having fully solved it. But it's also not some sad story about an athlete who simply can't let go. He did let go of the exact thing everyone expected him to be attached to, the title, the official record book, and found out that letting go of the official version of the fight didn't actually touch the underlying appetite underneath it at all. It just needed somewhere new to live and found it on its own without much help from him. There's a smaller admission buried in one of his longer interviews that I think belongs right here too. He said, half joking, that he's always carried a kind of imposter syndrome and told the interviewer to go ahead and judge him for it. That's a strange thing to hear from someone who's been ranked first in the world for over a decade. It suggests the doubt doesn't actually go away once you've won everything. It just gets managed well enough that it stops showing up in how you actually play. That's its own kind of mindset skill, separate from calculation entirely. Mastery doesn't really answer the question of what you're competing for. It just clears away the easy answer, which is other people. Once you've beaten basically everyone who could plausibly beat you, the opponent has to become something else entirely. And from what I can tell, nobody hands you that new opponent. You have to go find or invent one yourself. Sometimes it's a format that forces genuine creativity back out of you after years of it going dormant. Sometimes it's a number you'll probably never actually touch, and sometimes it's simply refusing to change your pants because somebody told you to, and discovering a little to your own surprise that the refusal still feels like something worth doing. There's a phrase that gets used outside of chess now, the grandmaster mindset, usually meaning some calm, almost robotic decision process, unbothered by ego, purely rational, 3 moves ahead of everyone else emotionally as well as tactically. Going through years of Magnus's actual interviews, that description barely survives contact with the actual person underneath it. What I found instead is someone whose rational side is genuinely real, the guy who can coolly explain fear versus love as 2 separate motivational systems and calmly give away the biggest prize in his sport, once the math on his own enjoyment stopped working out. Sitting right next to him is the guy who resigns a game in 20 seconds out of suspicion and slams a table because a single meaningless loss made him feel useless for days afterward. The mindset isn't calm, it's managed. I think that's the actual difference between how this gets marketed on a poster and how it apparently works from the inside, and it matters if you're trying to get better at anything competitive yourself, chess or otherwise. Copying the calm without understanding the management underneath, it just gets you the performance of detachment rather than the real thing. If there's a practical version of this for someone actually trying to improve, I think it's less about imitating his detachment and more about noticing where he chose to place it. He didn't kill the fire so much as move it off the one stage where it had stopped serving him, and let it keep burning everywhere else instead, sometimes usefully and sometimes clearly not. That's a harder thing to imitate than a quote on a poster, because it requires actually knowing which parts of your own game still deserve the fear and which parts have quietly turned into relief dressed up as ambition. Most of us never really stop to check the difference between the two. If I try to boil this down to something usable for an actual player working on their own game, is probably this. The ceiling isn't really about willpower or hours logged, it's about whether you've built an honest enough internal read on your own position to know when you're actually improving and when you're just staying comfortable. That's a harder habit to build than any opening line for any chess player, and it's the one thing running underneath every version of Magnus across all of this, the genes, the rating chase, the freestyle boards, the fist on the table.